So I'd just like to welcome everyone, speakers and not speakers. It's great to see you here. It feels perhaps like a significant event in the history of the African Cities Research Consortium because it's the first coming together, apart from Pacific webinars, we've done a couple now, of our research program. So for those who are listening and not involved in speaking, the African Cities Research Consortium is an FCDO-funded research program that is aiming to develop new approaches to interventions that will address African urban challenges, including challenges both related to poverty reduction and challenges related to securing better prosperity, economic growth and development. So that's the task. We have 6 years, we're about 9 months in, so to speak. We're about to start studies in 13 cities, which we are organizing in 2 sets. First set of 7 cities and the second set of 6 cities. That will take about 18 months, and then we will roll into a further phase, which will really look at new programming approaches to addressing African challenges. So this is very much a coming together of the consortium. We have a group of people who have experience in different African cities and are differently engaged in the consortium. I'm going to introduce them now. And then we have 3 questions. Our ambition for each of those questions is to have some reflections from the panel for about 15 minutes, and then to open for reflections from the participants. So if you have questions, if you have comments, we will open and give you a chance to input on the 3 questions. So let me just spend a couple of minutes introducing the panelists. So we have Joseph Muturi, who is one of the international leaders for Slum Shack Dwellers International, but he's also a very long-standing leader in Toy Market in Nairobi in Kenya. So Joe has worked with Shack Dwellers International in Kenya for, I guess, the best part of two decades now, Joe.
Definitely, yes. And
really worked across the spectrum of efforts to challenge injustice and disadvantage, dispossession, oppression, particularly in Nairobi, but across Kenya. So thank you, Joseph.
Thank you.
We have Patience Mudima. Patience is a planner, Zimbabwean planner, who is leading, who is director of Dialogue for Shelter, an NGO based in Zimbabwe, in Harare. So Patience works closely with the federation groups linked, as Joe is, to Shack Dwellers International, but has also a long experience as a planner in her own right and insights from that experience. Zimbabwe, as we all know, has had a very particular and extremely challenging years for urban development in general and for urban development specialists. We have Abdul Gafaru. Abdul Gafaru is someone I've known for some years, probably about 10 years, since you did your PhD at the Global Development Institute in Manchester. So Abdul Gafaru is an expert on political settlements, and one of the challenges that we've taken on with African cities is integrating the approach of political settlements with a more city of systems, a more systematic and systems-led development. So Abdul Gafaru is now back in Accra at the business school in Ghana, and I think will share important insights from his involvement in an earlier research center, Effective States and Inclusive Development, but also through the business school, a little bit of an entry into the fascinating and very challenging world of urban development. We have Shwaib Lassa. Shwaib, for many years, was directing the Urban Action Lab at the University of Makerere in Uganda, something of a critical geographer with a deep engagement in urban development and climate change, very involved in the urban chapters of the IPCC, and now based in the Netherlands at the Global Center for Adaptation. And then we have Lucy Earle. Lucy is working at the International Institute for Environment and Development, is a housing specialist. Lucy, that's how I was first introduced to your work, but now someone who's working very much on challenges around displacement, on refugees and migrants in cities, Africa and beyond, and an understanding of the need to bridge humanitarian and crises responses with longer term development agendas. So that's a brief introduction to the panel. Hopefully it's given you a bit of a flavour for the breadth of expertise that we're bringing to this panel. So I'm going to start off with the first question. And the first question that we set ourselves is, what should be city government's development priorities? We have 3 panel inputs, Joseph Maturi, Patience, and then Schweib. So let me start, Joe, with you. What do you think should be city government's development priorities?
Okay, now that we have put the name to the face, let me, because for clarity, let me just switch off this. Oh, thank you very much, Diana, and thank you very much for the invite. So I think I'll just mention in terms of the urban challenges. If you look at our cities, especially, I'm speaking to the context of Africa, with rapid urbanization, there are all these challenges which are coming up of congestion. We have seen a mushrooming of informal settlements. Now, to give you an example of my city of Nairobi, the informal settlements are full. Now we are building high-rise shacks. So I think in not particular any order, I'll just mention a few. Number one, city governments need to, I'll mention them, some of them, then I'll expound if time allows me. So there's number one, the improvement of infrastructure, that is the road networks. So many people who have been to Nairobi, you know, the airport is just 20 minutes away, but it take you 40 minutes from the airport. It will take you 4 hours from the airport to the city center. The other one is improvement of the health sector. The other one is water and sanitation. The other one is housing. The other one, the city needs to invest a lot in education sector, and I'll give you and I'll expand on that why. And this came as a realization recently of a study that we did. The other thing is food security, and I'll explain why. And the other thing is job opportunities. So all these are kind of interrelated in terms of the investments. If you look at the infrastructure, especially in African cities, if you look at the road networks, if you look at the facilities, they are usually strained. The city, I don't think the people who had planned initially the city didn't think that a city, they were probably planning for a city of 500,000 people. But if you look at a place like Nairobi, we are moving now to 5 million people. So the other thing I would say that expound is the health sector. I think all of us, with the pandemic, with COVID, it exposed us, it exposed a number of cities, a lot of cities, how unprepared they are because of city. Mostly when the pandemic hit, especially now, we are having the second wave. We still have challenges of not enough beds, and not enough hospitals, not enough quarantine centers. So people are moving around. We had even some very high level people dying because they couldn't even get a bed in hospital. So that's something. If you look at the challenges of also that come, especially in informal settlements, when there are diseases outbreak, cholera outbreaks, you'll find the nearest health facility is 10 kilometers away, 20 kilometers away. If probably at night, a lady is in labor, it becomes a challenge. So that's a priority that the city needs to invest in. So water and sanitation, that's a priority. I don't think I need to expand on that. If you look at the city of like Nairobi, the water, I think people have gotten used to the new normal of water rationing. So now, most of the time, I think we have moved away from even getting water 5 days a week. People get, the norm is now it's now 2 days a week. You switch on, you have to fill up everything. So they need to improve, to prioritize water and sanitation. The other one, which is closer to me, is the issue of housing. Once again, as I said, the city, with the rapid urbanization, everything like was centralized in the cities. If you wanted the good jobs, if you wanted the good schools, if you wanted to go to university, if you wanted services, if you wanted to get an ID, everything was centralized in the big cities. So you'll find that the cities was not prepared for people moving, the rural-urban migration. They were not prepared for these economic migrants who are coming to the city to look for jobs. So that led to the mushrooming of informal settlements. Most of you are aware of how the kind of conditions that most of the informal settlements people became creative. They occupied land, the invaded empty spaces, they invaded public spaces, and they invested, those who had money, and they invested in very poor housing. And I think the other thing, they also prioritize in terms of housing. You'll find that when we are talking to the city of Nairobi, because we have a very good working relationship with the county, if you interrogate how much money is put on housing, we realize that even the budget for snacks at the governor's office is higher than that of what the housing department gets. So it tells you in terms of priority, housing, I think, is at the bottom of the pile. So the other thing, food security, I mentioned. Once again, we were exposed by COVID. Most of the counties were shut off, where the traditional places where we usually get our food. So the government decided Nairobi is a hotspot, and I think it's from my SDI experience, it's in a lot of countries where there are all these lockdowns. There was no movement from city to city, county to county. So people are going hungry. People had money, but they couldn't get access. And the little food that came into the city was usually very, very expensive, which only the...
Just yes? 1 minute, please. Did you hear me?
Yes, you are telling me again. Oh, I've got 1 minute.
Yes, sorry.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. So the education sector. I think they also need to prioritize education. So one of the projects that we undertook with Nairobi County was the Mukuru Special Planning Area, and we realized there were only 2 public schools in that area, serving a population of almost 500,000 people. So we have almost 200 informal schools. These are people just put up structures, they put a desk and a chair, and they charge. The teachers are usually not qualified. The other thing also, the teachers are not qualified, they don't get any support from government. Same case with the health sector, where we have a lot of informal hospitals and clinics with people who are not qualified to handle. We used to call them quacks, but now the new term is informal service providers. So the last one, I think, is the creation of job opportunities, especially for young people. So there's a connection between lack of job opportunities and some of the social challenges that are in our cities, crime, drugs, early teen pregnancies, and all this. So I think the city also need to prioritize and create opportunities for job creation.
Okay, thank you. Let me pass very quickly and speedily to Patience. Patience, you're also going to add your thoughts for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Diana. My intention is to add to what Joseph has outlined without necessarily repeating what he has already said. I think cities, they occupy a very important space in the development processes of any nation. On one hand, we have national governments with their own development strategies. And often their development strategies are determined by...
Patience, that's a little bit towards the second question that we're going to come to in about half an hour. Did you have any thoughts on city government development priorities?
Yes, I do have.
Okay, please carry on.
Okay. So I was saying this position now that cities occupy, it's kind of a tug of war, with the development priorities on one end being pushed by national governments, that their own political agendas in terms of determining what should be the priorities for city developments should be like, and on the other, we have the urban population that also has expectations and also their own development and priority, their own development needs. And I think the development needs from the urban population has been well articulated by Joseph, and I'm not going to repeat that. But just to add, what should city governments consider in coming up with these development priorities? So to start with, I think it is important that cities are well informed about what is happening in their cities, for the sake of even coming up with projections so that they can plan for the future needs of the population. How this information is collected, who collects it, and who analyzes it, it's equally crucial in determining the development priorities. Because once it is politicized, which is often the case, it means that the citizens' needs are sidelined, and the politicians' priorities will be the ones that are outlined. So citizens' needs is already been articulated by Joe. It means cities need to prioritize getting citizens involved. And how do you prioritize getting citizens involved? There is an invest. Firstly, you have to invest in getting citizens to the table as participants, not beneficiaries of the city processes. It means also recognizing the differences within the urban population, and often populations that live in slums and informal settlements are disregarded. And once you do that, it means you have thrown away the priorities is of even up to a third of the urban population. So the development priorities of such a city will not be a true reflection of the needs on the ground. Another development priority that should be prioritized by cities is also the need to grow economies of those cities. And that also includes the reality of accepting the informality, the informal economy, as well as the informal residents and habitations and settlements that Joe was referring to earlier on. And lastly, there's need to look at the resilience of cities. There's need to invest in the resilience of cities as a priority. Those development priorities are not static. Things change, new dynamics come in, and things that are not necessarily planned for, they do come and mess up any development priority, unless there's an intention right from the word go to ensure that cities are as resilient as they can be. That's my contribution and addition, Diana.
Brilliant. And the lasting point of resilience, and leads very well onto Schweib. I suspect what you might say, anticipating, of course, the climate emergency, but please, Schweib, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Diana. Thank you for putting together this session and all the panelists. Great talk so far. I'll try not to duplicate or repeat what has been said, but I think we need to kind of step back a little bit and picture the cities that we're talking about in Africa. The cities that I know that I've walked from Berabera, Hargeisa, Kampala, Kisumu, I can mention all of them that I've walked, Niamey and the like, have a different trajectory of development historically and likely in the future, but they also have a different imprint, and they also have a kind of different social fabric compared to the many cities that are the reference points in terms of planning for development and promoting urbanization. And that will continue. But my feeling is that this has been a little bit of a universalization of how cities should develop. So no wonder we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about education and services and housing and other things here. But I think that that is a catch-up, and that catch-up has not delivered for majority, as Patience has mentioned, and as we know from our experience. And 22 years of teaching urban managers and urban planners in Kampala, in Makerere University, has taught me a lot that we need to rethink. And this, for me, is the key priority for cities going forward. That is rethinking. If there's anything that needs to be started with, it has to be a rethinking of how cities should be planned and developed. And what do I mean by rethinking? You have to embrace the reality of hybridization and heterogeneity of infrastructure. You have to ensure that you don't develop a city that squarely moves people, moves vehicles and not people. So all the roads we're talking about is basically moving vehicles, and that is less than 10% of the population, the mobile population in most of the cities that I know. But we should rethink that, and to plan cities, or African cities should replan and rethink to move people and not just vehicles. And I'm not saying it is either one and not the other. It has to be a mix, because the imprint and the nature of development of African cities has been different and is going to be different. I have doubts in my mind that there will be a deconstruction of many of these settlements in the cities that we know. I can also postulate that the informal is the city. Patience. The informal is the city. Work with it and then redevelop, bring decency to life. So rethinking infrastructure, rethinking the transportation systems, rethinking the way we create employment and opportunities that were very aptly discussed by Joel, for me means that you have to think more about the non-conventional employment sectors. You can think of it as informal. I call it emerging sector. And there could be many ways of integrating majority of the people in African cities into the urban economy. That could also include use of nature for the economic opportunities, but also use of nature for resilience. And I guess that's what Diana wanted me to talk about in terms of resilience, and not just resilience to climate change, but also social and economic resilience, because there has been an exemplification of the industriousness of the many urban dwellers that we have for long in literature and in practice called informal dwellers or slum dwellers or whatever you want to mention them. I don't want to use that phrase anymore. It is simply emerging, and those people have demonstrated that despite the levels, based of course on our benchmarks of universalization of development, they have demonstrated that you can have a life. What the parts that are missing in that life, or the many lives and careers, is decency, decency of employment, decency of housing, decency in terms of reward and salaries. And that can be actually promoted by the city governments to promote socio-economic resilience. But then on a wider level, city and city regional level, use of nature would also ensure that there is resilience to climate impacts and other kinds of disasters, especially now that we are also facing biological hazards like COVID-19. And this is going to stay. COVID is still around. Even if the vaccinations are ramped up in the next 12 to 24 months and everyone is vaccinated, the reality is that these small bubbles and areas which are opening up intermittently, they are actually enabling transmission and retransmission and mutation, which means we're most likely going to continue with a situation similar to the flu, the annual flu shots. And that means that whatever goes on in that scenario, if at all it happens, the priorities should not be moved or shift only to respond to that, because it's an emergency, a lot of people are dying, and then health systems are also put on pressure. The priorities should be balanced to address that, but also address natural hazards and address socioeconomic deficits, so that we shift from this catch-up and the universalization of urban development. So I just want to end by saying that when you talk of Africa, Africa is a huge continent. It's not a country. It doesn't have one language. So are the cities. They are so diverse in completely diverse socio-cultural realms and ecologies. These cities in these different ecologies have to be developed and planned in tandem with the local and social realms of those cities where they are situated. So Africa is unique in the sense that it provides a laboratory where we can change the knowledge that we have held for so long about how cities develop and how we should plan for them and infrastructure. And Africa at the same time is also unique that it has the resources that can actually propel the kind of approach to urban development that is different from what we know conventionally. So I thank you very much for the opportunity in this panel. Back to you.
Thank you so much. So we've had some reflections from Joe on citizen priorities and really highlighted the breadth of need and depth of need. Reflections from patients on how a development priority has to be finding ways to listen to what populations want and to draw them in. And then finally from Schweib, challenging us to rethink urban development, recognizing the diversity and recognizing the priority for developing people and not moving people and not transport, which reminds me of a very frustrated informal settlement dweller in South Africa who said about 10 years after democracy came, I thought the purpose of government was to develop people, and now I find all they want to do is develop housing. So we have 10 minutes or so if we have questions and comments from the floor, and then I would like to give all of the panelists, including those who have not spoken, 1 minute on this theme, and then we'll move to the next question. So do we have people, non-panelists, who would like to jump in with questions or comments? You're very welcome. You know the score. You can wave at me. You can put up your hand in the participants list. I'll try and find you. Or you can just talk. If you unmute, I think you can unmute yourselves. If you can't unmute yourselves, send me a chat message and then I will try and do what I can. Okay, Nikki, you, I think, raised your hand.
Yes, I suppose my question would, I have unmuted. Hi, everyone. Thank you. 3 really in sort of thoughtful responses that have also got me thinking. I guess my question leads us on to the 3rd question, so sorry if I preempt that. But this kind of idea of rethinking in ways that listen, as patients went on to say, that listen to citizens, who or do we have key actors that are moving towards those approaches? Are there any examples of cities that might be doing it differently? How can those actors be supported to do things differently in these ways?
Okay, thank you for the question. We also have a question or comment from Tim. Tim, you're on next.
Thanks very much. Thinking about that sort of long list of priorities that Joe in particular spoke to, I wonder if there's any one of those priorities that kind of underlies the others and could unlock change in the others in your view? Or is it that we have to work on all of them equally and simultaneously?
Okay, that's a fascinating question. Any other questions or comments? I'm going to pass back to the panel if they're not. Okay, so let me pass back to the panel. Let me suggest we start, Joe, with you, because the final question was directed at you, and maybe go Joe, Patience, Schweib, and then Lucy and Abdul Ghafaru. We'll give you a little bit of time.
Yeah, thank you, and I'll try to respond. I think, first of all, I'll respond to Nikki in terms of, yes, there are people who are rethinking, moving away from the old ways of doing things where citizens are just recipients of whatever is thrown to them by their city governments. And I think we have demonstrated for some of you, one of the projects that we have been doing here in Nairobi is the Mukuru SPA, where it involved a number of stakeholders across, but the planning process was led by the committee itself, and we organized almost 40 civil society organizations and academia to support this process. So basically, it was to support the county. Yes, this is what you prioritize. This is the way you do things, but we show them there's an alternative and a quicker way and a better way and a more participatory way of addressing development. It also ties to Tim's question of yes, I agree. There are things. One of the things we have been doing within the network as SDI. We look at how we transform informal settlements from a planning perspective. So we look at if you are going to address the challenges of informality through getting adequate, affordable housing, it has to go through a planning process. And through the planning process, the committees will tell you their priorities. They will tell you we need a hospital, we need, so it has to be approached from a planning perspective, which will address a number of issues. Once again, I'll refer to a live case study of the Mukuru SPA, where after we did the plan, now we have the government has come in, supported the plan. They are doing infrastructure, they are putting up roads, they are doing simplified sewer, they are providing free water to the residents of Mukuru. We have already, we already have two level 2 hospitals within. So they are also looking at now the education. So it's to look at, to rethink how we plan, instead of doing piecemeal, putting a hospital there, then you move away, somebody is doing something else at that other corner. I think it's how you mobilize resources, you mobilize skills across the board, you mobilize the knowledge, and you support the city in doing that, to rethink how they plan and to rethink how they prioritize.
Thank you, Joe. Let's move to patients. You may also have patients' perspectives on both questions: how to help governments to listen better, to hear their citizens, and what are strategic priorities that catalyze, pioneer reforms that catalyze change at scale.
Thank you, Diana. I'll start with the last one. The prioritization of development needs. I think we cannot be prescriptive in terms of what comes first, what is more important than the other, especially if we are buying in to the need to rethink our cities and to perceive the nature of growth in those cities, especially the fact that our cities in Africa are increasingly becoming informal. So that informality brings its own dynamics, which are totally challenging the way cities have been planned, administered, and even managed in the past. That's why the most important resource would be the people, and the people's ideas become central. And because of the nature and characteristics of informality, whether in the economy or in settlements, they are organized differently from the formal settlements. It's imperative for informal dwellers, for example, to be able to access any service, to have a collective approach, to be organized in their neighborhoods, in their lands, in their settlements. So that brings new dimensions of how cities are governed. Usually there is a set structure of governance that you have elected leaders, then who are councillors, who sit with full council meetings, but the realities on the ground are different. It's communities, if you have community champions who are part of, who are leading the organization of communities, who are leading a social cohesion within those communities, and then engaging with the city governments. That's a much more effective model of organizing cities and determining the priorities of any city. So you cannot take away social cohesion. You cannot take away social organization of communities in this new city. That is the reality in Africa now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Schweib, reflections on the questions. Can you unmute?
Yeah. Thank you, Diana. Both questions reminded me of the great piece that you're very familiar with, forget planning, politics first. And there's no space where politics is more important than cities. And everything that I'm hearing and we've been talking about in different fora has a lot to do with policies which are politicized. There's no doubt that policies and politics in cities, even at national level, are intertwined, and they can hardly be separated. So if you're going to scale up, you need to rethink the policies, because it is the policies that give the space to the very powerful people to control and value city assets in particular ways that disenfranchise many other people. It is the policies that determine the procedures. So even when we talk about listening, which we have been talking about for so long, it is because the political space is not attuned to the listening that we envisage. And that has to change. You need champions within that space in order to embrace the kind of rethinking that we're talking about. If you talk about catalyzing, for me, that seems to suggest that the traditional way in which cities have been developed and planned will have to find a sector or an element which is catalytic in nature, that it will unlock others. Mm-hmm. I think everything is equally important. What would be catalytic is rethinking the political space of policies and procedures. And that around that, you can start thinking about and being challenged with how do you mobilize the resources. Again, Patience has demonstrated, and many other projects have demonstrated, that you can even mobilize more resources from communities that can make a change, perhaps even much bigger change than the centralized kind of financing. Around that space, you can think about infrastructure, different types of infrastructure. You can think about employment opportunities. Now, when it comes to housing, and again, you're very familiar with this, Diana. For me, housing is the ultimate in many people's lives in cities, and they look up to something that with which they will identify. And it is something in the way that African cities have developed, which is so difficult to be programmed by a city municipality or any external agency, unless if you find a catalysm in employment opportunities. Nobody, whether it is Mukuru or Katanga or Cosmos cities or Kailisha, nobody living in that place would not like to see his or her house improved. But what limits them is opportunities. So if you create the opportunities, then in the long term, housing will be more or less a seamless outcome of the opportunities created through alternative infrastructure, through alternative services, and also embracing nature. So those are my reflections to the question.
Okay. So thank you. And we will come very particularly to politics in our final question. Okay, let me now pass to Lucy first, and then Abdulghafari, to reflect on this question and the comments from their own area of expertise. Lucy.
So I guess this doesn't necessarily come from my own area of expertise, but just some of what Schweib was mentioning in terms of his experience as a planning educator reminded me of an initiative from the African Centre for Cities, which I'm sure Schweib was a part of, with the African Association of Planning Schools, that were trying hard to introduce new materials into curricula across, I guess, English-speaking African universities. So these were based on sort of the reality of cities as we know them, rather than this sort of aspirational, the gleaming spires of that sort of future, that future Kigali that people talk about, for example. So, so that's, I suppose, Nikki, there are people who are trying to shift, educators trying to shift the way in which planning is taught and understood. And I guess just a reflection on the African Cities program, I hope, Diana, that we're able sort of to start dialogues with universities in the cities where we're working, thinking about the kind of materials that they might need to be able to introduce these ways of teaching planning that are grounded in the realities of the cities rather than these difficult to achieve cities that are perhaps sort of in people's imaginations and very difficult to actually build for people who live in them. So it was just an observation, perhaps, and a comment on the future of African cities' engagement with planners.
So yeah, thank you. And I would say that we have that aspiration, I think, building particularly on some work I was doing with Patience and her colleagues in the Zimbabwe Federation and Dialogue on Shelter with the University of Bulawayo, who are not part of African cities, but were very excited about the possibility of building new and more relevant materials for teaching planning. Abdul Ghaffari, do you have any final thoughts on this first question about city government's development priorities before we pass to the second question?
Thanks, Diana. So just quickly, I mean, when I reflect over the long list of development priorities that city governments need to actually pay attention to, the key thing that comes to my mind, kind of just thinking specifically of the Ghanaian context, is the question of resources, is the question of revenue. I mean, because in the Ghanaian context, you have a situation where city governments are overwhelmingly dependent on national governments for revenue, because internal revenue generation tends to be very, very low. It is estimated that about 80% of resources to local and urban government authorities actually comes from the central government, which tends to be very unpredictable. But also, these city authorities don't have autonomy over the use of these resources, in the sense that in most cases, up to about 80% of revenues from central government to local and urban government authorities are earmarked for implementing specific central government programs and projects. So I mean, I get the impression that it's also going to be very, very crucial for city authorities to prioritize the issue of revenue mobilization, tax collection, and internal revenue mobilization, but also the question of how they can enhance or increase their autonomy in terms of how these resources get utilized.
Thank you. Well posed. We, of course, have to deal with the question of resources at all scales. And I'm sure we'll come back to that. So when we look at the third question and the political obstacles and opportunities that prevent and or facilitate. Before we turn to the third question, we're going to stand back a little bit and look at the role of urbanization for national governments, which Joseph talked a little bit about the awareness in the pandemic of the challenges of urban development and the scale of poverty and disadvantage in urban areas. But there has been, as I think we'll hear, an increasing awareness among national governments of the significance of urbanization. So we're going to start with you, Patience, and then come to Abdul Ghaffari. Please.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, I'm going to give you my perspective on the role of urbanization in national development strategies in the context of Africa. And for the sake of clarity, urbanization here, I'm referring to the growth in the proportion of the population, of the economy, and of the spatial space that is urban. And those distinctions, how we distinguish, how we divide up the nations into urban, rural, is a very great bearing on how national development strategies are set. For example, there's an assumption that it's the dichotomy between urban and rural is very, it's black and white, is very clear. But if you see the growth in African cities, is mainly in informal spaces. The growth is mainly informal, whether it's in terms of economy or even spatially. There's a very important third dimension that is peri-urban. And this period, maybe, so we should maybe stop talking of a dichotomy and maybe speak more of a trichotomy, where we have the urban, we have the rural, we have the peri-urban, so that we are as inclusive as we can be, and so that the national governments can also take into account the realities of growth in their countries. And given the need to include the peri-urban spaces, you will notice that how a government perceives this very important space determines whether they see urbanization as an opportunity or as a challenge or a threat. And their responses are determined by this perception. But I think it is urbanization offers opportunities, and especially in the following facets. If you look at the economy, the national economy, and the role that urbanization plays, urbanization offers opportunities of improving the efficiency of production due to the densities that are associated with urban spaces, and even the need to meet the various needs that were articulated in the previous discussion. All those are unfilled markets. People need water, they need sanitation, education, etc. So all those are opportunities of increasing the urban economy and at the same time improving the national economy. But I think what is more important is not just increasing the national cake, as it were, but it's mainly how it is distributed. That plays a very important role, especially when you manage to reduce populations, urban populations that are income insecure. Because if they have more access to disposable income, it means their demand for goods and services, even some of them that are coming from the rural areas, increases. So that way you also be in a position to increase the economy further. So a nation that wants to develop, to increase its economy, it better pays close attention to urbanization as a catalyst of that change. But you can also as well look at the link between urbanization and, say, environmental strategies, especially around spatial, the different land uses. Urbanization brings a lot of challenges that are related to land pressure. It can be land pressure as a result of urban sprawl, where land uses are being rezoned from predominantly rural to urban. It can also be issues of densities and how they are managed. It can also mean even the effect this growth, especially growth in buildings, etc., can have the effect it can have on wetlands and even water catchment areas. And so you need to pay close attention to how cities are developing and growing in order to balance between urban and rural and between the different land use zones within a particular nation. You can also even look at the social political strategies that are related to this dichotomy between urban and rural. Often urban populations are perceived as the centers of opposition politics in Africa. And so how the urban population is organized can be seen as a threat by national governments. But for those that see it as an opportunity for populations being able to influence how cities are planned and managed, it can become a very important strategy of integrating and including the population in development strategies. That's the contribution I have, Diana. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So highlighting the contradiction around urbanization in Africa and beyond Africa, really with a very ambivalent nature, as we've indeed seen in Zimbabwe, where the government clearly has been very nervous about political opposition in the urban context and indeed sought deliberately to manage that opposition. Let's now pass to Abdul Gafaru. Abdul, I'm not sure if you're going to talk about Ghana or think more widely.
Thank you, Diana. I'm not so sure whether you, just before I start my conversation, if you want to put my video on, feel free and do that. I'm told the host has put my video off, so that's why I'm off.
Okay, I can ask you to start your video.
Okay. Okay, good.
I'm not, I think I have new powers on the Hoover platform that I haven't got on Zoom, but there you go.
Okay, no, thanks so much. I'm going to speak specifically in the context of Ghana, I mean, which I think is a very interesting case for discussing the role of urbanization in national development processes, because Ghana is considered as one of Africa's early urbanizers and was actually the first in sub-Saharan Africa to adopt a national urban policy. Ghana, within the context of UN Habitat kind of processes in the 2000s, Ghana has also experienced a rapid pace of urbanization in recent decades, in the last 3 decades in particular, and also currently faces many of the challenges associated with rapid urbanization. I mean, most urban areas have sort of started to see the side effects of rapid urbanization, including problems of congestion, unregulated expansion, the rapid kind of growth of slums in cities, problems with sanitation, increased urban poverty, decline in access to services, affordable housing, and so on and so forth. And mainly due to internal migration, the urban population has increased very rapidly in the last three decades, and the urban population reached 16.5 million in 2018, which was about 56.1% of the country's population, and it's actually projected to reach 72% by 2035. I mean, interestingly, the rapid pace of urbanization in the past 3 decades has not only coincided with sustained economic growth and poverty reduction, but there's also some evidence that kind of points to some causal linkages between these processes. I mean, there is some recent World Bank study which concluded or which identifies urbanization as one of 3 key drivers of growth and poverty reduction in Ghana, and that urbanization actually played a very central role in Ghana's emergence as a lower middle income country in 2010. One problem is that the developmental benefits of urbanization have not been equitably distributed in Ghana. I mean, partly because of the overconcentration of growth and development in few cities. The urban landscape is sort of just dominated by 2 large cities, Accra, the national capital, and Kumasi. And one key characteristics of rising urbanization is the concentration of large towns and cities in more broadly in the urban sector, which tends to kind of exacerbate some historical north-south developmental gaps in Ghana. In the last decade, Ghanaian cities have also enjoyed sustained political support from all governing political parties. I mean, Ghana has 2 dominant political parties, the current governing New Patriotic Party, or NPP in short, which professes to be a liberal democratic party, and the main opposition National Democratic Congress, which sees itself as a social democratic party. Historically, the NPP was seen as an elitist party that drew its support mainly from urban areas, while the NDC was kind of generally seen as a rural-based party. However, in recent decades, changing demographic and electoral dynamics have actually changed political elites' perspectives about urban areas, because both political parties now actually vigorously compete or compete for votes from urban constituencies, in part because a national population and housing census that sort of was conducted in 2010 somehow heightened the political attention to cities. I mean, providing a very clear signal that majority of the population was actually living and would continue to live in urban areas. So from 2011, 2010, thereabout till now, we've seen an array of policies aimed at promoting sustainable urban development in Ghana, beginning with the passage of the launch of the National Urban Policy in 2012, with the goal of promoting sustainable, spatially integrated and orderly development of urban settlements. And again in 2015, there was the National Development Planning Commission published a National Spatial Development Framework to be implemented over a period from 2015 to 2035. And the framework actually pays a lot of attention to issues of urbanization and human settlements, dedicating as much as 50 pages to this issue and highlighting the need for a policy shift aimed at addressing emerging challenges associated with rapid urbanization. So you see, an array of policies and strategies that now aim at kind of promoting sustainable urban development in Ghana. And I think there are a number of views, a number of reasons that kind of explain the increase in attention to issues of urbanization and to addressing the challenges faced by urban residents. Let me just focus on two very related political factors. One of them is actually the increasing concentration of potential voters in the national capital, Accra. If you take a look at Ghana's current electoral register that was used for the 2020 presidential elections, the Greater Accra region, the most urbanized region with over 90% of its population living in urban areas, had almost 3.6 million voters. Now, come to think of it in the specific Ghanaian context, within Ghana, within the context of Ghana's electoral environment, this is really, really huge, because you have regions like the Northeast region, the Savannah region, with voter populations of less than 300,000. And you have a situation where in Ghana, elections can be won by just a few thousands, a few tens of thousands of votes. And if you take that as some two very large constituencies in Accra, the Domi Kobunya and Ashaman constituencies, which actually had a lot more voters than entire regions in the country. Secondly, and more importantly, unlike many other regions in the Ghanaian context, where you have regions kind of leaning towards one of the two dominant parties, Accra is a typical swing voting region. And it is actually very difficult for any political party in Ghana today to win presidential elections without winning Accra. There is almost always very close electoral contest between the NDC and the NPP in this region. In this 2020 elections that we just had, the NDC won by 51% and the NPP took 48.1% of the vote. And that's how close elections between these two political parties are in the Greater Accra region. And largely because of their increasing electoral importance, there have been some unprecedented efforts kind of aimed at addressing the problems of slum dwellers and various deprived urban settlements in recent years. In 2018, the governor NPP established a special fund called the Zongo Development Fund, which is aimed at providing financial resources to develop and transform the social and economic conditions of urban dwellers, deprived urban dwellers. And the government also established a full ministry, and that was the first time in Ghana's history, an entire ministry called the Ministry of Inner City and Zongo Development, with a vision to creating prosperous, inclusive, and sustainably developed inner cities in the Ghanaian context. So, and if you look at actually the NDC, which historically has been seen to be a more rural-oriented or rural-based party, you could argue that it even now appears to be more pro-urban than the NPP. I mean, because it was this party that published the National Urban Policy. It was this party that launched the spatially development, the National Spatial Development Program. And if you take a look at the 2020 manifesto, I mean, I was just doing some word count in terms of the word urbanization in the party manifesto. I mean, it's mentioned over 40 times, and that gives you a sense of how much attention is now being paid to these issues. And the manifesto also contains several initiatives, several special initiatives aimed at enhancing the development of urban centers. It talks of the need to launch a smart urban transit service, urban water, a new peri-urban agriculture for agricultural production, initiate a labor-intensive public works program in 4 urban settlements, liaising with banks and financial services in establishing new housing schemes, and so on and so forth. So apparently, it doesn't matter which of the 2 political parties in Ghana is in power. I mean, the whole issue of urbanization is now very, very firmly rooted in Ghana's development agenda. But of course, there are also some problems, I mean, associated with these developments. I mean, one is the key point that to some extent is the short-term political party manifestos that appear to drive investment decisions than national development programs or national development strategies per se. And the problem also is that how long these policies and programs are actually implemented often tend to depend on how long the party in government that formulated them actually continues to stay in office. And part of the politicization actually relates.
If you just 1 minute.
Okay, less than that. Part of the problem actually relates to the point I made earlier about the subordinate relationship between city governments and national governments. I mean, where municipal and metropolitan authorities tend to depend on central government, not just in terms of funding, but also to a large extent for policy directions, and partly because of the manner in which city authorities tend to be selected in the Ghanaian context. So I think I'll leave it there, and we can take up the rest at the conversation or discussion level.
Thank you. So in a sense, we've had a whistle-stop tour of the attitudes that have prevailed, a recognition that their productivity increases in the urban context that can drive increased resources and possibilities, of course, for rent acquisition. A concern also mentioned by patients about the urban centres as being centres of opposition, but also, I think, Abdul Ghaffari, as you highlighted so powerfully, a real sense that there are electorates to be won and elections to be won. So changing attitudes, really clearly changing attitudes, even before this current moment and its emphasis on COVID and concerns related to that. Let's just see if we have questions coming up from the floor, our floor, and then we can also see what the other panelists wish to contribute. Sam, I can see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Diana. Thanks for the comments. Both rounds have been fascinating. On the politics question, how much does this have to be negotiated between the national and the city level? So there are these incentives, electoral incentives being driven by rising urban populations, the particular youthful nature, maybe the disruptive nature of urban populations and their oppositional character very often, more nuanced in Ghana. Is this, are these pressures that can be responded to directly by the national level? How much does city level politics intervene in this, particularly if you have a different configuration of political party competition there compared to that which prevails nationally? So just a question from our panelists who will have different contextual insights to bring. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions? I'm going to throw it back to the panel, but I also have a question which I think has been bubbling around our own discussions, which is how different are smaller towns, or how different is the politics of smaller towns compared to larger cities? And are we in danger, I guess, of perceiving changes in urbanization related to national development strategies through a big city lens and ignoring smaller towns? So let me go back through the panelists. Let me start, Abdul Ghaffari, with you, then go to patients, and then go to the other panelists.
Okay, so to Sam's question, my I mean, if you reflect over the manner in which things work in Ghana, it seems very, very difficult to separate city level politics from that of the national, largely because probably I would argue is because of the manner in which city authorities are actually selected. City governments actually tend to implement central government policies, not necessarily policies of their own, because as a mayor who is actually appointed by the president, how long you stay in power depends on how long your president stays in power. Once there is a regime change, once there is a change of government, what happens is that all mayors would have to also leave the office for the new president to be able to appoint a new set of mayors. So this tends to create certain incentives for mayors themselves to prioritize the implementation of the policies that will keep their governments in power. So to a significant extent, cities don't seem to have autonomous policies that are kind of autonomous from what the central government actually is interested in implementing. And a point I made earlier, that many of these cities also tend to depend heavily on the central government, and the central government actually earmarks 80% of what these city authorities need to do with the money. What it means essentially is that they have discretion over just about 20% of the resources. So you see a very, very close relationship between these two tiers or two levels of government. Just briefly on the question about whether there are differences in terms of the politics of big versus smaller towns. I think one key difference I see is the capacity of citizens in the bigger cities to mobilize, to demand certain things, particularly taking opportunities around election times to get things done. The level of mobilization at the moment there's a movement going on in Accra called Fix the Country. It's just started by a few individuals using social media, raising concerns about frequent electric power outages in Accra, poor sanitation, poor water, and housing problems, blah, blah, and so on. And there's been an ongoing fight between the police and government on the one hand, and this was just started by one single person using social media, and it is now in court because they want to go on demonstration on the streets, and the police the government used its powers to quell that effort, but they went to court. You wouldn't see this kind of mobilization efforts at the smaller towns, and that tends to probably kind of compel government to pay more attention to issues concerning developmental challenges of residents in bigger kind of urban areas than their smaller counterparts.
Thank you. Patience. Oh, yeah, I'm not on mute. Patience.
Thank you, Diana. I think in the case of Zimbabwe, all the urban local authorities, without an exception, are in the hands of the opposition party. And that brings a lot of tension with the national government. And unfortunately, that tension has resulted in a lot of disturbances in the way the cities are managed, because there's a lot of interference in terms of even appointment of key personnel, like the chief executive officers of the cities, etc. So it becomes a political hotbed. The cities become a political hotbed, and it's very difficult for development to take place when there are political contestations that are taking place. So, for example, for the seat of Harare, for instance, during this term of, there've been possibly 3 or 4 changes in who occupies the mayor's seat. And including key positions being held by acting directors, etc., because of these contestations. And that has a direct impact on service delivery. The impact is, of course, negative. And also, cities are not entirely independent in terms of not only the appointment of personnel, but also even in terms of their budgets. Their city budgets have to be approved by central government. And because of these political contestations, the government might go for policies that are very populist instead of practical budgets being approved. You get very populist budgets that are approved. And in some cases, city decisions are vetoed by national politicians. A few years back, we woke up with an announcement by central government that we're not supposed to pay any city rates. So people stopped paying rates. So you can imagine the impact that will have on city finances. But so I could go on, but I think I want to address the other issue on the difference between smaller cities, the dynamics of smaller cities and larger cities. I think administratively, the smaller cities, we have a grading of urban centers in Zimbabwe. We have the small ones with a population of 5,000, at least 5,000, which we call urban, which we call growth points. Then we have local boards, and then we have towns, municipalities, and then cities. So, but you will find that for the smaller urban nodes, they are not local planning authorities in their own right. They are part of the rural local authorities. So their policies, their urban policies are determined more, are influenced more by their local planning authority or the local authority, which will be rural. And also there's a huge debate on this structure of urban centers and what has influenced this structure. Is it natural? Is it organic growth? Or it's more of political definitions of it? But I concur with what Abdul was saying for Ghana, that the bigger cities, they tend to, at least in terms of the population, their involvement in politics, it's much more evident than in the smaller urban nodes within a rural setup. They tend to be perceived more as rural, even in terms of the political dynamics of those particular areas.
Okay, thank you. So we'll have just a very brief set of comments from other panel members, and then we'll turn to the last question, which addresses some of the political opportunities and obstacles directly. Lucy, did you have anything you wanted to reflect on in this conversation? No, okay. Schweib, did you have anything you wanted to add at this point?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Let me add very quickly on the point that Abdul raises around national urbanization, spatial planning frameworks and whatever. It's also connected to the point I raised earlier, whether it is a World Bank report, whether it is a national consultants report on how cities and urban areas are important in Ghana to national development. It is good, it's a good starting point, but it is not the end in itself. And it's the space where you have to think, and there's need for leadership. Maybe the leadership could come from the national governments. Maybe the leadership could come from the Association of Mayors of Cities and Urban Areas in Ghana or any country in Africa, maybe it could be catalyzed externally by some people outside the country or outside the cities themselves. But it is just having the policies and the planning frameworks is not testimony to the transformation that is needed in Africa's urban space. And it's very important that we kind of push back a little bit on some of these programs and reports, because they tend to promote the traditional approach to urban development, infrastructure based. In a space these days where actually that seems to be the heart of everything around resilience building. So if you can have more drainage systems, you have more roads that are crisscrossing the city or crisscrossing the country, then it means that the country is resilient. That is not true, and we know it. But we have to push back a little bit on those on those kind of approaches and reports, and we have to go beyond the reports, and it's not an easy thing. So again, I go back to the champions. Who is the champion here in this panel or in this team on this program, and who can we rally if we identify one or two champions here who can talk about Africa's different urbanization process and how it links to national development. And last one quick thing is that any urban place that is developed in any African country that is not fully integrated into the rural situate where it is located is actually only going to serve the interests that Precious is talking about. Why some cities get more resources and not others, because they simply have the majority of the opposition. So you can see that whereas the laws and policies and politics is actually designed or is purported to be working in public interest, it may not actually be the public that we're thinking of in this panel. It is something different. Thank you.
Thank you, Shwai. Joseph, did you want to add anything at this point?
I think in terms of, just to address your last question, looking at the smaller cities and the big cities. So I think most of the big cities in Africa, you'll realize that most of them, with the rapid urbanization, most of them are getting full now. And I think the shift and the focus will now be moving to the smaller cities. And I think part of the work, part of the work that we do with Cities Alliance is to look at the smaller cities, because in a few years' times, if all these challenges are not addressed in the smaller cities, the smaller cities will end up looking like what we currently have. So it's to address the situation right from the word. And as Shoaib said earlier, that Africa is a continent, and I think most cities have got different characteristics. But if you look at it in terms of the priorities, national governments tend to, for lack of a better word, interfere or poke their noses in cities that they have an interest in. Just for example, for us, we moved from the city, now we have something called counties. So the president looked at the Nairobi County as being very important in terms of, and he thought the governor couldn't manage. So he brought something called the Nairobi Metropolitan Services, which is basically under the management of the army. Basically, the president is running a parallel government from the county government, from the elected county government, just to implement. He thought probably the army, because of the command structure, you shoot first, ask questions later. He was assigned to do. It worked for us because it's the army, which is the Metropolitan Services, which is doing a lot of development in informal settlements, whereas the elected county government were just paying lip service and doing these little things, a water tap there. And so I think it's where they have an interest in. And I think the other interesting dynamic is now, because of all these people seeing if national government interferes with the running of the city governments, I think we are going to have a referendum soon where I think one of the questions, if we should return the city of Nairobi to the management and office of the president.
Thank you. Challenging times. We're now going to pass actually directly, Joe, to your own reflections on politics and the significance of politics. And one of the things that really characterizes African cities is that half of our cities are in fragile and conflict affected states. So it seems in that context very appropriate that the first panelist is going to speak, Lucy, has something of an expertise on those more challenging circumstances. And in some cases, the people who leave situations of conflict and war to come to cities. So Lucy, please start us thinking about political obstacles and opportunities.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you everyone for the rich discussion so far. So it's my job to steer us in a slightly different direction now and to talk about refugees and internally displaced people, IDPs, in urban areas. I guess it's quite hard for me to know who my audience is here, but even when I'm speaking to humanitarians, I often have to sort of remind them of the significance of the fact that at least 60% of refugees globally are living in towns and cities. And those are people who are in the business of responding to forced displacement. That statistic often gets repeated, but people generally don't know what to do next with that knowledge. So this sort of trend of refugees moving and IDPs moving towards urban areas. On the refugee side, that has been bolstered, those global stats, by the Syrian crisis, where you have the vast majority of Syrian refugees moving into towns and cities in the region, in the Middle East. But those trends were already visible before the start of the Syrian crisis, civil war in 2011. On the question of IDPs, those people who haven't crossed an international border but have been displaced as a result of conflict or disaster or very large development projects, for example, it's much harder to get the data on that, on where they are. These people, their movements are not tracked as closely as refugees. Their returns are also not tracked. And so it's hard to know when someone is no longer an IDP because they've gone home, or if they feel as though they're now an urban resident and they would no longer identify as someone who's displaced. But globally, the data is around sort of 55 million IDPs to 26 million refugees in the world. And in terms of the numbers or the percentage in urban areas, the Refugee Agency, where it's working with internally displaced people, reckons around 2/3 are in urban or peri-urban areas. And the Center for Global Development recently took 17 countries with good data and concluded that it was common for at least half of all IDPs to be in urban areas. And this is an issue in African cities. Many countries that are hosting refugees do have encampment policies. So it is, their policy is that refugees should live in camps. And I think that's often people's understanding of a refugee situation is a vision of a remote area with rows and rows of white tents. And that is, that is the reality for millions of refugees in Africa. But there are increasing numbers of people who are bypassing those camps or leaving those camps. And often it's not legal, according to the national policy, for them to do so. In terms of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, they should have freedom of movement across countries, but national policies often demand encampment. And this means that refugees in urban areas may get no assistance at all, either from the UN or from international agencies or the host government. And I think critically, refugees have not been seen as a city issue. So Joe Maturi's colleague, Jack Macau, is working on a project with me on refugees in 4 countries and including at Kenya, where we're looking at refugees in Nairobi. And he said, well, refugees have not been seen as a city issue. And to their credit, Joe's colleagues are really trying to get refugees onto the agenda. They recognize that there are many tens of thousands of refugees in Nairobi, the majority of whom are living in informal settlements amongst other residents, economic migrants and Kenyans. And they see that these are not people who are just passing through, these are residents, and often long-term residents. It's not expected that the crises that have caused these movements are going to end anytime soon. And actually, this taking refugees as a city issue and thinking about how you respond to refugees and other displaced people in development plans is really critical, given there's a movement towards, in Kenya anyway, a statement that camps are going to be closed. I mean, the statement's been made by national government before, but if you are going to close these camps and potentially give work permits to certain nationalities of refugees, where are they going to go and how are they going to build lives for themselves in urban areas? And similarly, in Ethiopia, there had been statements about closing camps. It's another country where we're working, where I'm working, and where we're going to be working on with Diana as well. So given the general trends around the desire to live in urban areas and the inability of return for many, we'd like to see refugees continually moving to cities, but no one is really prepared for this. Certainly not the UN Refugee Agency, that doesn't really have a policy that works in terms of how to engage with city governments. And in many cases, we're sort of talking, perhaps not talking huge populations, so thinking about Dar or Addis or Nairobi, it's very hard to know how many refugees there are in those cities because it's not really legal to be there, except under certain circumstances. In Addis, if you're an Eritrean, you have more ability to sort of exist without harassment or without the threat of return, but not necessarily. But perhaps more significant across the continent, and certainly in a number of the cities that we're going to be looking at with Diana and the team, there's a question of IDPs, people displaced by conflict who've not crossed the border but have moved into cities. And here, the numbers are significant enough to be having real impacts on the urban fabric and on the availability of services for all residents. So if you think about Mogadishu, there is perhaps as many as 500,000 IDPs in Mogadishu, Maiduguri in Nigeria, possibly around 300,000. And then in other countries, for example, I've recently involved some consultations with mayors from Burkina Faso. In some cases, the populations of their cities have doubled, or towns. They're not small places, but you imagine what you do when your population doubles within the space of a year, and yet you're not getting a recognition of those new numbers from central government and what that might mean for your ability to deliver services. And I think what's important to think about also is that the humanitarian mentality towards displaced people, the idea of sort of to set up camps, which does happen within cities. So there are camps in Maiduguri, for example, and there are settlements within Mogadishu. It's allowing refugees to IDPs in this case, to self-settle or set up camps specifically for them. It actually can be a way of divesting responsibility away from city or national government and imposing these populations on international actors. But we shouldn't forget that IDPs are citizens, and displacement is increasingly protracted. It's not just a matter of sort of living in a tent for a few months and then being able to go home. You have hundreds of thousands of people in limbo, sometimes for decades, and living in extremely vulnerable conditions and at risk of further displacement. So Mogadishu is a very interesting example of this, where land is made available illicitly for IDPs, conflict and drought-affected populations. To begin with, they live with almost nothing in terms of services. There is sort of a degree of management of these sites by informal settlement management, sometimes called gatekeepers. But as the international humanitarian actors step in to provide water, to provide some basic infrastructure for sort of roads and some minimal transport energy, this land becomes more valuable, and then IDPs are evicted, and slightly better off people move in. And then the IDPs, and there are such huge numbers of them, we're talking tens of thousands of people being regularly evicted, creating new settlements. And the city is growing really in a way that's on the backs of some of the most vulnerable people. And that's no way for a city to grow. And in Mogadishu also, these people are disenfranchised. So if you're not a resident, classified as a resident of Mogadishu, and you can't be if you're an IDP, you have no right to vote. So you also have a disenfranchised population. And I think the more that you have them, you put these populations onto, hand them over to international actors, the greater there will be an undermining of confidence in city government to provide services, to deliver development, and a lack of sense of representation of this population as well. So IDPs can really remain outside the political arena despite being citizens. And I think this, for me, is also really important to think about sort of the protracted nature of so many conflicts that create refugees as well. So refugees may not be citizens, but they are becoming long-term residents who deserve a voice and a say in city planning processes. I suppose this is my sort of, in a way, sort of call to ensure that we look at these issues properly within African cities, and I'm sure we'll be able to. But I think if we think about the way the world is going with the sort of increased mobility in a context of climate change, displacement is going to become more and more a city issue. And we need to be set up better to be able to respond to the needs of displaced people and incorporate them into our urban development planning. And I think otherwise we're going to end up with a disenfranchised and extremely vulnerable population that will be a sort of barrier to sustainable development.
So thank you, Lucy. Really challenging thoughts that complement, I think, the discussions that we've been having to date, although clearly no easy answers to the previous problems and indeed to this one. Okay, we have Schweib, who's also going to have a couple of minutes of reflection on political obstacles and opportunities that prevent or facilitate urban development. Schweib, you touched on this earlier, but please expand.
Yeah, once again, thank you, Diana. Yeah, the urban areas and systems are really very interesting from a political angle. For many African cities and urban places, they are also the locales for asset building on the part of the public entities and governments and politicians, but also asset accumulation for the people. And that brings almost like two categories of actors in cities on different sides of the aisle. And there will always be contestations, and one or both will always try to block the access to the kind of opportunities and benefits in these urban areas, which is very much around the materialization of urban systems. So I'm thinking about water, I'm talking about transportation, who manages and controls that? And between cities, especially those that are adjacent to each other, there is also competition for the control of these materialized urban systems. So if you have a metropolitan region like Nairobi, as we had, then the nearby cities, or maybe Thika, I don't know whether it is very far, would also be interested to take a portion of the transit systems between Nairobi and Thika, or transit system between Nairobi and Naivasha, or whatever. So this is happening a lot, and therefore the political obstacles to urban development are very much entrenched into the actors, the different actors who make different decisions on a daily basis. So we can talk about the public entities, the politicians. You also have the professionals, and then the developers. For me, the developers of the city are not necessarily public entities. The developers of the cities are actually the individual developers, whether it is a small, whatever you want to call it, house in Dagoretti or in Katanga, or it's a big mansion on the hillside of Ngongs or Kampala Kololo. That is the developer, and they also control and wield some power at their different locales, and they will try to always, kind of push back. Think of it as noise to public policy if it is not in their interest. While the public entities are very much controlled by the politicians, wielding their power that is derived from the regulations and the laws, will always also try to exert a lot of pressure and control over the materialized spaces of urban areas that we see. So the question is, the obstacle is between the main obstacles are between the actors, and that is because there is limited opportunities or systems within the policies that bring these actors for what I called earlier public interest, in the true sense of public interest. Each of the different actors is trying to that. Now, whether that is attainable is another question, but if it is not attainable, then it is also possible to think about systems that apportion the interest in the different categories of people to reduce the tensions and the noise and the competition around these materialized aspects or artifacts of the city. So politics is about value, politics is about the interest and how to control and appropriate that value. And cities are spaces where you have all kinds of assets that are valued by different people, and they will always try to use whatever instruments within their power and reach, whether it is laws or regulations or physical plans. The Mukuru plan is also an instrument of power. Whether that power will be redistributed between the metropolitan services, now that is providing some of the roads and the county government and the original residents and beneficiaries of Mukulu, that is an outcome that we're yet to see once that plan gets rolled out and the implementation and services start to get in and people start to invest, the developers start to invest at different scales. So, but there are opportunities also. There are a few successes that we also have to bring and learn from them, especially the bad aspects of it. Earlier on, we talked about scaling up, and the politics can inhibit, in many places, has inhibited scaling up these really very interesting solutions to urban areas. And two of the projects that come to mind is the Orange project. What do we learn from that, especially what went wrong? Why wouldn't Orange be replicated in many other places? What about the Cosmo project in Johannesburg? What do we learn from that? Like you said earlier, Diana, it seems that the other part of the stakeholders who wield power on the materialized spaces of urban areas in South Africa are building houses, but they're not building the cities. And what does that mean? And it very much plays within this discussion about the political impedances to get the right vision for the cities and for the communities and everybody who is using the city. So again, the city is not for only one or two categories, it's for everybody. And it is very difficult to identify a system or a suite of systems that can bring all these interests in a way that is attainable by all. Yeah.
So very challenging, yes, thank you. We have two more brief presentations and then I think we'll wind up. Abdul Ghafaru, you're next. You have 2 minutes and then Joseph, I'll pass to you. You're on mute. Do you want me to, I don't know if I unmute you or you unmute yourself.
Can you hear me, please?
Okay, now you're good.
Okay, thanks. So I'm just going to focus on one key political obstacle, which I think is also an opportunity. And this relates to the highly competitive nature of presidential elections in Ghana and the polarized nature of the electoral environment more broadly. I mean, mainly because of electoral competition, important reforms such as those aimed at decongesting the central business district within cities, for example, are often halted when elections are actually approaching because of protests by traders and so on and so forth. I mean, secondly, and related to this is the point that I made earlier about the fact that mayors remain presidential appointees, and there is overwhelming evidence that this kind of these appointees tend to, in most cases, be more accountable to the ruling parties that appoint them than the people that they claim to be actually represent. Unfortunately, reforms aimed at enabling citizens to directly kind of elect their mayors have historically been characterized by feet dragging, apparently because the presidential appointment system is an important means by which ruling parties dispense patronage aimed at winning highly competitive elections. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, the fact that these mayors are appointed also implies that regime changes automatically lead in leadership changes at the city level, which tend to undermine the continuities in policies and governance. Of course, there are also concerns and questions as to whether multi-party elections in urban governance will necessarily lead to better mayoral accountability. I mean, this remains an open question because elections in Ghana are not entirely issues driven. Ethnicity continues to play an important role. I mean, other factors like voter illiteracy, and various forms of voter manipulation still remain important within the Ghanaian political landscape. I mean, on the other hand, you can also think of the electoral environment as kind of providing windows of opportunity for reform, and much seems to depend on the ability of citizens to form coalitions and mobilize at critical moments in history. There is a study that I read recently, which kind of drew attention to the central role played by citizen activism in the redevelopment of two market infrastructure in two Ghanaian cities quite recently, in Cape Coast and Kumasi, when traders utilize electoral movements to adopt different kinds of strategies involving campaigns, protests, demonstrations, organizing press conferences and forming alliances with sympathetic politicians and getting things done. So you can think of the electoral environment both as a constraining kind of factor, but also as an opportunity. One key dilemma here is that whereas the political environment actually makes such mobilization efforts among citizens very critical in tackling the developmental challenges of urban residents, the same kind of factors, the polarized nature of the environment also makes mobilization very difficult, because you have residents being divided across political parties and seem to be united more by the parties that they belong to than the common developmental challenges that confront them. So when you begin to organize, a demonstration, a street protest, and so on, it's very, very easy for political opponents to read political meanings into it, and which also tends to undermine collective action efforts among citizens in terms of mobilizing towards more sustainable forms of urban development.
Thank you. Okay, Joseph, did you have any reflections to share?
Yeah, I think once again I'll refer my reflections to the Mukuru process and what we looked at some of the challenges that come with the political class. So initially, when it comes to how politicians, and that is from the councillors, the members of the county assemblies to members of parliament, how they prioritize their development is in terms of what is in for them. And I think in the past, it has been, that's why if you move to a number of cities, you'll find there are so many white elephants. There are projects which are unfinishing. They are very grandiose. Somebody wanted to build a very big whatever, which at the end of the day, probably the resources were misused. So what we look at that, and the other thing we realize is that the threshold for public participation is very low. The politicians can call few of his cronies or his buddies to a fancy hotel, and that is called public participation. And I think what informed us in Mukuru was to make sure that we set the bar so high in terms of public participation, to make sure that's where we had the Nyumba Kumi group, 10 households making a sector, and we made sure they participate in that. So, and I think that's one thing. It's the citizens, is the community taking that power from the politician and say, these are our priorities at the moment. So the other thing, like I mentioned before, the political class, it's the lack of political goodwill. If you look at what happened, we have been talking about the SP, and we started working with the previous governor to support the Mukuru SPA. And there was a lot of support, basically from the technical people, the directors, the managers, because all of us understand that politicians usually have a sell-by date. They are relevant up until the next election. So, and for us, the strategy was, how do we use, because these directors, the director of planning, the director of water, the director of housing, if you form alliances with this guy will survive. These guys will survive the politician. Luckily for us, that politician, the one who started it, he was kicked out. The new guy came in. He was talking about Mukuru SPA, but there was zero support because he was still playing politics. He was held at ransom by the structure owners. He was held at ransom by the informal because they also have resources. There are his cronies, there are his buddies. So he didn't put any resources to that. So the political goodwill came in, and the president wants to leave a legacy. He wants to say that he's coming to the end of the term. I did this for these informal settlements. So I think that's goodwill coming from him in the last days of his administration. It showed that with political goodwill, things can happen, things can move, there can be changes. So the other thing we are not addressing also, I think it's a big one in terms of how politicians manage resources, is the corruption angle, where if people will be, if an administration or the managers are seen to be corrupt, there is a relaxation in commitment to funding projects. There is less investments as the cost of doing business is very high. This leads to fewer goods hitting the market and highly inflated prices. The other thing is when an investor views corruption as a form of tax, the incentive to invest is lowered significantly in these cities. So once again, we also end up with inferior public infrastructure that hinders the good flow of business. Earlier, we talked about infrastructure. The systems are broken down with substandard materials being used for the public amenities. So that's also, I think, can be an obstacle how the political class, the councillors, the mayors, the governors, how they handle resources.
Thank you. I'm very conscious that we've run out of time, and I think we've had a good summary of some of the core challenges that we're going to have to engage with. So reflections about the ways in which national government understands cities and intervene in cities. Reflections about city government challenges, both around infrastructure and indeed beyond infrastructure. I'm kind of conscious that we almost came full circle in the last few comments. Patience, moving off your concern about citizens not being heard, about city governments finding ways to hear citizens. Lucy's explanation of this particularly disadvantaged group, which may not even have votes, even if they are indeed citizens of the country in which they're located, because they've moved. And then perhaps a little bit more optimistically, efforts by electorates to hold city governments to account and issues around participatory planning. So I just wanted to thank all of the speakers. I wanted to thank all of our loyal listeners who are still hanging on in there. Ezana will be writing up the debates and we'll be sharing it with the panelists so you can ensure that you have a chance to edit your comments, reflections. And I would just, like to say thank you to all of you, listeners and panelists. So thank you all.